Y'all. I'm pleased to introduce our witnesses for today's hearing. Before we do that, I want to ask unanimous consent for Representative Moylan from Guam to be waived on to the subcommittee for today's hearing for the purposes of asking questions. So without objection, so ordered. Our first witness today is Mr. William Evanina, Chief Executive Officer of the Evanina Group and former Director of the National Counterintelligence and Security Center. Our second witness is Mr. Rob Joyce, owner of Joyce Cyber LLC and former Special Assistant to the President and White House Cybersecurity Coordinator. I know I'm going out of order. We'll get there in a minute. Our third witness is Mr. Charles Carmichael, Chief Technology Officer at Mandiant, and our fourth witness today is Mr. Stephen Kelly, Chief Trust Officer at the Institute for Security and Technology. I would now like to recognize myself for 5 minutes for my opening statement. Earlier this year, top intelligence and cybersecurity officials testified before the Select Committee on China about a vast, long-term, and ongoing campaign by the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, to hack into the computer systems that operate America's critical infrastructure, our dams, power plants, transportation hubs, and other essential operations. We don't know the full extent of this campaign. Why? First, the hacks are done in a manner designed to avoid detection. Second, the perpetrators aren't trying to steal data or cause systems to immediately go haywire. It's worse. This campaign, labeled Volt Typhoon, has been underway for several years at a minimum. The Chinese government and its state-sponsored actors are using an infiltration tactic called living off the land. The hackers' aim is to blend in with normal Windows system and network activities and remain undetected, according to one cybersecurity expert. Using malicious software, Volt Typhoon finds vulnerabilities to penetrate internet-connected systems to take control of devices like routers and security cameras, for example. The goal here isn't smash and grab type theft or immediate system disruption. It's a lot more disturbing because China is playing the long game. It's silently pre-positioning itself for disruptive or destructive cyber attacks against U.S. critical infrastructure in the event of a major crisis or conflict with the United States. That's according to an advisory jointly issued this year by the National Security Agency, the FBI, and other federal agencies. In other words, the CCP is biding its time until it's reason to awaken these cyber sleeper cells. At the critical moment, they'll trigger them to create confusion and disarray across America by disrupting our power supply, our transportation, our communication networks, our water, and our food supply. This is a terrifying but realistic scenario. It also illustrates how China's cyber warfare against the United States has matured. It's now part and parcel of its military strategy and its plan to achieve its broader ambitions on the world stage. Earlier this year, General Paul Nakasone, former head of the NSA and U.S. Cyber Command, testified, "The People's Republic of China poses a challenge unlike any our nation and allies have faced before, competing fiercely in the information domain." Today's hearing is a forum to discuss the challenge posed by China's cyber warfare and how we must, as a nation, meet that challenge. We know China is throwing massive money and manpower into its efforts. FBI Director Wray recently testified the PRC has a bigger hacking program than that of every major nation combined. In fact, if you took every single one of the FBI's cyber agents and intelligence analysts and focused them exclusively on the China threat, China's hackers would still outnumber FBI cyber personnel by at least 50 to 1. 50 to 1. What a massive, massive number. This speaks to the necessity of the U.S. maintaining its technological edge over China, including in cutting-edge fields like artificial intelligence and quantum computing. AI is increasingly being harnessed as both an offensive and defensive tool in cyber warfare, and post-quantum cryptography will be key to safeguarding critical data in the future. We also need to bolster cybersecurity partnerships between the federal government, the private sector, and international allies. These are vital pathways for sharing threat information. Finally, we need to widen our talent pipeline to help fill the hundreds of thousands of cybersecurity job vacancies that currently exist in the public and private sector of the United States. To facilitate today's dialogue, we are thrilled to have testifying today individuals who've recently served at the highest levels of the federal intelligence community. But before we introduce, well, I already introduced them. I skipped the order. So you're here. So we will now recognize you for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Forgive me for being a little late, but we have too many hearings. I have 2 markups, 2 hearings, 2 briefings, and 2 sets of votes today. So maybe we should cut back on some hearings. This past March, the Office of Director of National Intelligence released the annual threat assessment of the U.S. intelligence community. An excerpt from the report reads, quote, "China remains the most active and persistent cyber threat to U.S. government, private sector, and critical infrastructure networks," unquote. Chinese Communist Party poses as a significant threat to the safety and economic prosperity of the United States. Through a multi-pronged strategy that includes the Belt and Road Initiative, economic coercion, and military buildup, the CCP has sought to challenge the American-led rules-based international order. As part of its larger campaign to conduct asymmetric attacks on the United States, Beijing has turned to cyber attacks to steal American companies' intellectual property, undermine our civil society, and disrupt civilian and military infrastructure. Just 2 months ago, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA, confirmed that CCP-sponsored groups like Volt Typhoon have successfully infiltrated the federal government's civilian and military systems. What's more, some of those groups have been on our networks for up to 5 years and lay in wait until the opportune moment to disrupt a military response or to disable our water and power infrastructure. Unfortunately, when it comes to cyber warfare, the threat extends beyond China. In fact, experts have identified that not just China, but also Iran and North Korea are using Russia's well-known disinformation playbook to disrupt elections, infiltrate American companies, and generally cause malign behavior. Although disinformation campaigns and cyber attacks are not identical, they are 2 halves of the same chaotic coin. They similarly seek to inject uncertainty into daily operations and undermine the foundation of businesses, communities, and democratic values and tenets. Last November, Meta released its 3rd quarter adversarial report, which outlined the removal of nearly 5,000 fake accounts, all based in China. Meta removed those accounts for impersonating U.S. citizens and posting divisive rhetoric on deeply sensitive internal political issues with the intent to have an impact on the upcoming 2024 presidential election. It's not just America at risk. Earlier this year, the CCP again employed Moscow's tactics of online disinformation to cast doubt upon Taiwan's government and to influence its recent elections. China has made a concerted effort to extend its power and influence across the world, especially in the global south. As roughly half of the world's population heads to the polls in 2024, China will take this opportunity, no question, to expand its influence and disrupt democratic processes using all tactics at hand. Fortunately, the Biden-Harris administration has taken unprecedented steps to counter these threats, both direct cyber attacks and disinformation campaigns. The White House released the first ever national cybersecurity strategy in October of 2022, directing both public and private stakeholders to coordinate efforts to address new ambitious plans called the International Cyberspace and Digital Policy Strategy, seeking to work with allies to counter both Russia and China's global election interference efforts. I'm also proud to have partnered with this administration to safeguard networks against harmful nation-state actors. Historically, this subcommittee has held hearings to conduct meaningful oversight of federal IT programs and worked alongside the Government Accountability Office to produce a biannual scorecard on compliance with FTAR. Agencies then receive grades based on compliance with the law and other statutory-based IT priorities. Scorecard assesses compliance with the Federal Information Security Modernization Act, FISMA, evaluating all 24 CFO Act agency cybersecurity postures. For further transparency, and after years of congressional advocacy for metrics to replace the expiring Trump-era cross-agency priority data, OMB finally began publishing quarterly federal cybersecurity progress reports on performance on performance.gov website. These reports measure agencies' progress in achieving milestones and implementing key cybersecurity measures articulated in President Biden's executive order on improving the nation's cybersecurity. The executive order encouraged adoption of zero-trust architecture, and I encourage the administration to evolve the performance.gov data and provide public metrics in order to assess agencies' implementation. To successfully stop our foreign adversaries, we need a whole-of-government approach with bipartisan congressional support to bolster our federal workforce and its IT infrastructure. And we need a whole-of-nation approach to combat the disinformation and misinformation coming out of Russia and China. A report from the Center for Security and Emerging Technology found that, quote, by 2025, Chinese universities will produce more than 77,000 STEM PhD graduates per year, compared to approximately 40,000, almost half that, here in the United States. If international students are excluded from that number of the United States, Chinese STEM PhD graduates would outnumber their U.S. counterparts by more than 3 to 1. 3 to 1. For our country to compete effectively with China, we need to implement the Office of the National Cyber Director's National Cyber Workforce and Education Strategies recommendations and bolster our cyber workforce and cyber faculty pipelines. We'll soon introduce legislation to enhance the already highly successful Cyber Corps program, which boasts an impressive 97% successful job placement rate. When passed, I hope that legislation will extend the scholarship cap of this program from 3 to 5 years and provide a pathway for more STEM-trained PhDs. We must properly fund the cyber defenses and basic government IT by reauthorizing and properly funding the TMF. In 2021, Democrats fought to secure $1 billion investment for that program, although the President had requested $6 billion. Today, the TMF has funded 11 zero-trust efforts as well as numerous other cyber projects to protect our military and sensitive information while retiring vulnerable legacy systems. Congress usually sees IT as an easy thing to cut, but in most cases, IT modernization is a critical investment with a critical return on it with respect to the future. Pandemic exposed the cracks in the federal government's aging IT infrastructure and how it impeded mission-driven programs. Upgrading those systems is not just a national security priority. It's essential to making sure government stays effective and serves the people. State-sponsored cybersecurity and disinformation campaigns seek to undermine the very fabric of our society. Cyber attacks wreak chaos and prove costly. Disinformation campaigns obscure the truth and threaten democratic principles. We must work to resist and oppose both. I look forward to the hearing, and I look forward to hearing from our witnesses. Thank you, Madam Chairman. I yield back.
Pursuant to Committee Rule 9G, the witnesses, if you'll please stand and raise your right hands. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony that you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Let the record show the witnesses all answered in the affirmative. We appreciate all of you being here today and look forward to your testimony. Let me remind the witnesses that we have read your written statements and they will appear in full in the hearing record. Please limit your oral arguments to 5 minutes. And as a reminder, please press the button on the microphone in front of you so that it is on and we can hear you up here. And when you begin to speak, the light in front of you will turn green. After 4 minutes, the light turns yellow and then red light comes on. Your 5 minutes has expired, and I'll very kindly smile and wave this thing and ask you to wrap it up. So y'all can be seated, and I will recognize Mr. Evanina to please begin your opening statement. 5 minutes.
Chairwoman Mace, Ranking Member Connolly, members of the committee, it's an honor to appear before you today with my esteemed colleagues at the table. Our nation faces an array of diverse, complex, sophisticated, and unprecedented threats by nation-state actors, cyber criminals, and terrorist organizations. Each of them, in their own distinct manner, pose a serious threat to our nation, our systems, and our citizens. However, and unequivocally, the existential threat to our nation emanates from the Communist Party of China. This comprehensive threat is the most complex, pernicious, strategic, and aggressive threat our nation has ever faced. It is an existential threat to every fabric of our great nation, our capitalism, and our democracy. Xi Jinping drives a comprehensive and whole-of-country approach to the CCP's efforts to invest, leverage, infiltrate, influence, and steal from every corner of the United States. Naivete by those who hope to otherwise believe the opposite will only accelerate Xi's intentions and progress. Additionally, the United States private sector, critical infrastructure, academia, and research and development entities have all become the new battle space for the CCP's nefarious activities. As this committee is aware, it is currently estimated that the economic loss from the theft of intellectual property from the Communist Party of China is nearing $600 billion per year. To make it more relevant and personal, that equates to approximately $6,000 per American families of four after taxes. China's ability to strategically obtain our intellectual property and trade secrets via legal, illegal, and sophisticated cyber and hybrid methods is like nothing we've ever witnessed before. It is said by many to be the largest theft of intellectual property in the history of the world. Technology, from ideation to manufacturing, is frequently the intended target of these efforts. Additionally, it is estimated that 80% of American adults have had all of their data stolen by the Communist Party of China. The other 20%, just most of their data. Data and technology have become two of the most valuable commodities in the world, and acquiring them has been a high priority for the CCP. I believe we must approach this existential threat with the same sense of urgency, leadership, spending, and strategy as we have done for the past 2 decades in successfully preventing and deterring terrorism. I would offer to this committee that we are in a terrorism event, a slow, methodical, strategic, persistent, and enduring event which requires a degree of urgency of government, action, and corporate awareness. It is clear that under Xi Jinping, the CCP's economic war with the United States, combined with his intent to be the military leader of the world, has manifested itself into a terrorism-like framework. Let me be more specific. The CCP's capabilities and intent are second to none as an adversary. Countless cyber breaches, insider threats, and nefarious penetrations into our critical infrastructure are ubiquitous and have been widely reported. Adding the CCP's crippling stranglehold onto so many critical aspects of our supply chain, and what results is domestic vulnerability we have not seen in generations, if ever. Now we must confront and defend against these CCP efforts with all the known and unknown artificial intelligence accelerators which will come along. As we continue to drive forward with AI development for the good, we must also ensure security safeguards are implemented to protect from the bad. For all the progress we make, we must equally think of the potential of a zero-day exploit utilizing sophisticated AI. When we incorporate China's recent actions to include, as referenced by the Chairwoman and Ranking Member, the Volt Typhoon, sophisticated surveillance balloons across our sovereign land, technical surveillance stations just 90 miles away in Cuba, maritime port threats, Huawei, strategic land purchases near military installations, fentanyl, TikTok, malign influence, etc. The collage begins to paint a bleak picture that's beyond blinking red. I'm not even addressing space, deepfakes, or 5G or genomics. The inability or unwillingness to look behind China, the curtain they provide, and deal with the existential threat is no longer an option for the Congress, for the administration, academic institutions, and the private sector. There is no more curtain to look behind. It has been removed. There must be consequences levied for China's actions. Otherwise, there will continue to be no deterrent. Volt Typhoon should be the straw of the proverbial camel's back. Unfortunately, I believe more is to come. Thank you for the opportunity to join my esteemed fellow witnesses, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you. I will now recognize Mr. Joyce for 5 minutes.
Chairwoman Mace, Ranking Member Connolly, members of the subcommittee, it's an honor to be here before you today. Thank you for this chance to discuss what I believe is the most significant cybersecurity issue faced by the U.S. That's the threat from cyber attack from the People's Republic of China and the threat it poses to our critical infrastructure. I'm Rob Joyce. I served over 34 years at the National Security Agency, retiring as the Director of Cybersecurity, and I hope our conversation today, I get to provide you some insight into the sophistication and strategic implications of these PRC cyber threats, and really how the PRC competes fiercely in the cyber domain. It's been widely understood that for years, PRC hackers have stolen intellectual property. They've performed traditional espionage through cyber, but now they're preparing attacks against our critical infrastructure through cyberspace. So that first segment, they stole intellectual property. This is to aid their domestic industry. Chinese state-sponsored hacking groups like APT41 have systematically conducted cyber espionage campaigns to steal trillions of dollars worth of intellectual property and trade secrets from U.S. companies. It's been across critical sectors like aerospace, pharmaceuticals, energy, manufacturing, and more. For example, a multi-year campaign uncovered in 2022 showed APT41 had infiltrated over 30 multinational firms and exfiltrated hundreds of gigabytes of proprietary data, including designs for fighter jets, missiles, drugs, solar panels, and other cutting-edge technologies not yet patented. The brazen thefts rob American companies of their R&D investment and competitive advantages, undermining U.S. economic interests. The annual cost to the U.S. economy from IP theft is hundreds of billions of dollars. And that does not include the long-term impact where China closes technology gaps and brings competing products to markets using stolen information. In the second area I'd highlight is the hacking for traditional espionage. A good example of that cyber espionage is the intrusion last year into the U.S. State Department, in which the U.S. State Department discovered the compromise of its email system. The attackers accessed the inboxes of the U.S. Secretary of Commerce, the U.S. Ambassador to China, Congressman Don Bacon, and key State Department employees. All of this was before a sensitive visit by the Secretary of State to China. Microsoft assesses the intrusion was a Chinese threat actor they call Storm 0558. According to the Cyber Safety Review Board study of this event, of which I was a panel member, the activity was so stealthy, Microsoft still can't say with certainty how the credentials used in the attack were stolen from them. The issues of espionage and intellectual property theft have persisted for years, but now I want to highlight an even more troubling set of intrusions into critical infrastructure. In 2023, the U.S. cybersecurity community developed increased understanding that a set of PRC hackers called Volt Typhoon was pre-positioning on U.S. critical infrastructure. They were not there to steal our information, but instead prepared to disrupt vital critical infrastructure systems. They want to slow the U.S. military's ability to mobilize and deploy in time of crisis, and they want to sow societal panic at the time of their choosing. They hope we would turn inward and focus on serious critical infrastructure problems at home, rather than supporting any crisis on the other side of the globe. My colleague, the Honorable Evanina, talked about a simple description for their intent: domestic terrorism. They want to inspire panic inside our society. That's serious and disturbing. So this activity was discovered and validated through unique collaboration of government and industry, and I sit here today with some of my industry partners. Foreign intelligence was used in conjunction with the tremendous insight of industry, where NSA, along with multiple government agencies, both domestic and international, described the intrusions in a public advisory, and 11 of the biggest internet and telecommunication companies added their names to the publication as participating in the investigation. Subsequent work by FBI, CISA, and industry confirmed the compromise of IT systems in diverse infrastructure sectors, including communications, energy, transportation, water, and wastewater systems. They found pre-positioning in the continental U.S. as well as the U.S. territory of Guam. Guam is significant because the island hosts the Andersen Air Force Base and Naval Base Guam, which play a crucial role in any potential conflict with China over Taiwan. The intrusions have gone on for quite some time, but have generally escaped notice. It's increasingly important that we understand this siege, that we work against it, and that we get our systems prepared to not only get them out, but keep them out. These activities by the Chinese government warrant your full attention and support, ensuring the PRC cannot undermine our national security. And I look forward to answering your questions alongside this knowledgeable panel.
Thank you. And Mr. Carmichael, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairwoman Mace, Ranking Member Connolly, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to share my observations and experiences regarding this very important topic, as well as for your leadership on cybersecurity issues. My name is Charles Carmichael, and I'm the Chief Technology Officer at Mandiant. In my role at Mandiant, I oversee a team of security consultants and incident responders that help organizations both respond to security events and prepare for and mitigate the risk and impact of those security events. I led the teams that are responsible for discovering and identifying the SolarWinds software supply chain attack in December 2020, the Colonial Pipeline cyber destructive attack in 2021, and the discovery of several novel and sophisticated cyber campaigns carried out by China Nexus threat actors. I'm here to talk about Mandiant and my personal experiences in defending against and responding to cyber threats emanating from the People's Republic of China. I'll share my firsthand observations and the observations of the team that I lead. Before we discuss today's threats, it's important to review what's happened over the past decade. On September 25th, 2015, the United States and China agreed that neither government would conduct or knowingly support cyber-enabled theft and theft of intellectual property for an economic advantage. The following year, in 2016, Mandiant analyzed our incident response cases to assess the impact of the agreement. We actually observed a reduction in cyber intrusions by China Nexus threat actors that began a year prior to the agreement. The relatively lower volume of intrusion activity continued until approximately 2020. Government-backed China Nexus threat actors operated notably differently prior to the agreement than they do in modern days. In my written testimony, I talk about specific ways in which China Nexus threat actors operated prior to the agreement. These actors operate very differently today. They're more coordinated, resourced, sophisticated, and clandestine. I want to talk about a few of the capabilities that we see them demonstrating as they effectively break into organizations across the globe, but specifically in the United States. We see them leveraging zero-day vulnerabilities, which essentially are vulnerabilities that are known by threat actors and exploited by threat actors before the vulnerability is known by the vendor. The tools and the know-how to exploit these vulnerabilities are shared amongst multiple discrete groups that conduct cyber operations for the benefit of the PRC. Over the past few years, we've observed targeted zero-day exploitation of vulnerabilities in VPN, firewall, email security gateway, hypervisors, and other technologies that don't commonly support endpoint detection and response solutions. Endpoint detection and response solutions have gotten more effective over the years and have enabled organizations to detect compromises in Windows environments. Therefore, we see China Nexus threat actors targeting those systems that don't traditionally support EDR solutions, which essentially makes it more difficult for organizations to detect compromises. To further exacerbate the problem, we see threat actors leveraging vulnerabilities in closed box appliances, which are essentially systems that provide routing functionality, firewall functionality, or other security functionality to organizations. Because these appliances are closed box, it makes it very difficult for organizations to actually determine if they're compromised. If an organization wants to forensically examine a compromised device, they often need to reach out to the vendor in order to be able to analyze it. Not all vendors will actually give permission to the victim organization to analyze the device. We also see China Nexus threat actors leveraging residential IP addresses to conduct their intrusion operations. Over the years, they've built a very large botnet or series of computers that essentially enable them to access victim environments such that they look like an employee of the organization by accessing the network in a close proximity to the employees or to the companies that they want to log into. So for example, if they were targeting a company in Virginia and they wanted to emulate an employee that lived in Virginia, we would see them leveraging compromised home infrastructure that allows them to log into the VPN of that Virginia-based organization and look like an employee there. We also see them living off the land, which is essentially leveraging tools and technologies that are native to operating systems so that they can move laterally within environments and not get detected by the organizations. Given the advanced tradecraft leveraged by China Nexus threat actors, it's incredibly difficult for organizations to tell when they've been compromised. In fact, when we work with organizations and discover compromises, we often see that those compromises very often have lasted for weeks, months, and sometimes years. Over the years, I've personally observed multiple China Nexus threat actors with significant access and privileges to US-based technology, defense, government, energy, construction, chemical, financial services, and healthcare organizations. Fortunately, I've not yet personally observed any actions taken by these actors that I consider to be overtly and intentionally destructive that could directly lead to negative kinetic outcomes or physically harm people. That could certainly change over time, but I wanted to share my personal experiences. On behalf of Mandiant, I thank you for this opportunity to testify before the subcommittee.
Thank you. And Mr. Kelly, you're now recognized for your 5 minutes.
Chairwoman Mace, Ranking Member Connolly, and members of the subcommittee, my name is Steve Kelly. I am the Chief Trust Officer at the Institute for Security and Technology, a think tank that unites technology and policy leaders to create actionable solutions to emerging security threats. I came to IST almost a year ago after retiring from the FBI as a special agent working cyber issues. And during my tenure, I was honored to twice serve on the NSC staff. Bonnie and I have since moved back to Indiana, but I'm glad to be here in the nation's capital to discuss this pressing topic with you. I am gravely concerned by both the PRC's illiberal global agenda and the means by which it seeks to realize it. For at least 2 decades, the PRC has carried out a rob, replicate, and replace strategy which allows Chinese firms to benefit from stolen American innovation, begin manufacturing identical products at a lower cost, and put the victimized firm out of business. Over time and across numerous research and development areas, this strategy, enabled by large-scale economic espionage, has allowed the PRC's technology industry to rapidly catch up, and in some cases surpass the United States and allied nations. Chinese technology products, both inside the PRC and for export, prioritize state-level interests over users' security and privacy, exposing users to government surveillance, acting as a vector for cyber operations, and potentially enabling denial and disruption operations. This has been a challenge here at home, leading Congress to fund ripping and replacing Huawei and ZTE equipment from U.S. telecom networks. But the challenge is even greater in developing nations that often find the immediate need of economic development more pressing than the potential foreign intelligence risk. I'm encouraged by a recent surge of interest in trusted technology within the investor community. For example, a group of leading investors recently announced their voluntary trusted capital investment principles and commitments. Another leading venture capital firm announced its American Dynamism effort, and an array of investors and founders are driving a new defense tech-focused movement. While it has been a long time coming, many throughout the world have come to recognize the risks that often accompany lower-cost Chinese products and are seeking more trustworthy sources, even at a price premium. I played a small part in planning and launching the U.S. Cyber Trust Mark, a voluntary security labeling program for consumer Internet of Things devices, like smart home appliances, and I'm pleased by the enthusiasm shown by consumer technology manufacturers in this program. While the FCC is moving the program forward, I encourage Congress to ensure the program's future stability by specifically authorizing and funding it. The threat described by my fellow witnesses should inspire a new sense of urgency to remove the PRC's leverage by consistently counteracting and publicly exposing their cyber operations, and by hardening U.S. critical infrastructure. Given numerous cyber attacks impacting critical infrastructure over the past several years, including the ransomware attacks on Colonial Pipeline, JBS Foods, and many hospitals, we are clearly not doing enough. While ransomware is not the focus of this hearing, it is instructive of the real-world impact cyber operations can deliver. If Russian criminal gangs can achieve these effects, the People's Liberation Army most certainly can too. President Biden's national cybersecurity strategy calls for establishing minimum cybersecurity requirements for critical infrastructure through regulation, or where such authority does not exist, to seek it. While federal regulations are not appropriate or desired in all circumstances, I believe that safeguarding functions essential to national security, economic security, or public health and safety warrants a regulatory approach. If establishing baseline requirements is to be achieved, Congress will need to create or clarify regulatory authorities for certain sectors, and each sector risk management agency and regulator must be resourced to carry out the task. The infrastructure in need of protection is scattered throughout the nation, and it is difficult to meet their needs from Washington, D.C. Fortunately, there are a variety of players across the federal enterprise who are able to engage at the local level. CISA's Cybersecurity Advisor Program, which places personnel across the country, is still quite new, and often an entire region may have only one such advisor. While I encourage Congress to fund the sufficient advisors to cover the ground, what remains clear is the need for expanded and enhanced partnerships as force enablers. Fortunately, CISA cyber advisors are not alone, as the FBI and Secret Service have task forces across the country. Emulating the successful Joint Terrorism Task Force program, there exists incredible opportunity to team federal, state, and local cyber personnel to undertake both proactive and reactive cybersecurity efforts. National Guard units acting under their state authorities might also plug into this model. And given the topic of this hearing, I think it is worth considering what authorities might exist or be needed for active duty cyber personnel under Title X to provide assistance or even protection to civilian entities essential to the operation of key military installations, also referred to as defense critical infrastructure. While this approach may not scale, I believe there are scenarios under which that would make sense and should be explored. I want to thank the subcommittee for inviting me to participate in today's hearing and look forward to your questions.
Thank you. I will now recognize myself for 5 minutes of questioning. I do have several questions, so if I could just ask if we could be brief and direct and straightforward in our responses, because I would like to try to get through all of them today. General Nakasone has stated that if a nation state decided to attack our critical infrastructure, I would say that's above the threshold level of war. And in the testimonies that was prepared, it refers to China's cyber warfare against the U.S. as a form of terrorism. And Mr. Evanina, you said today it was an existential threat, in your words. So in the face of this terrorism, Mr. Evanina notes there's little deterrence also. So my first question to you, Mr. Evanina, if these CCP-driven hacking campaigns are a form of war on terrorism, are we deterring China from conducting them?
Thanks for the question, Chairwoman Mace. If we are deterring it, I'm not aware of that. From an intel perspective and a law enforcement perspective and a cyber perspective, what they are doing to us is on the border of...
Why not? Why aren't we deterring?
You would have to ask the policymakers in that pace, but I do believe in the same, as they're preparing for battle, as we heard, and our critical infrastructure, I don't think it's reasonable for the minimum standards to ask companies to defend against nation-state threat actors and their proxies. I think it's a big task for them to do, and I think you as government should take more of a hand in defeating and deterring the Chinese Communist Party in our infrastructure.
Is it safe to say this administration doesn't have a strategy for deterrence?
I'm not aware what the current strategy is.
Okay. Okay, so my next questions will be for Mr. Evanina and Mr. Joyce. Do we know how many of America's critical computer systems have been infiltrated via the Volt Typhoon hacking campaign? Do we know?
I'm not aware.
Mr. Joyce?
I do not have that information.
Okay, so if it's achieving its goal of gaining undetected system access, how would we know?
So, Madam Chairwoman, I believe the combination of intelligence, right, that revealed this campaign, as well as the capabilities of the U.S. cybersecurity industry, has the ability to find and defeat some of these activities. But it's going to take a combination of both the public efforts, the private efforts, as well as the targeted entities have to remove some of their outdated legacy IT to be safe.
Debate that's been going on for the better part of 30 years, probably. Mr. Joyce, do we know how much money the CCP invests in cyber warfare?
I do not.
Mr. Evanina, do you know?
I do not.
Do we know what kind of manpower they throw into these efforts? We heard what FBI Director Wray said recently, 50-1 in terms of comparing it to FBI analysts, but do we know what kind of manpower they have?
I think that's a conservative estimate by Director Wray, but I also would include in that the cyber criminal actors and their proxies that are supported by the MSS and the PLA should be included in that number as well.
Okay, AI and quantum computing are powerful new tools in the arsenal of both hackers and defenders in cyberspace. How much does defense of critical U.S. computer systems hinge on our ability to maintain and build upon our edge in AI over China? Either of you?
So I believe that AI is actually going to advantage the defense much more than the offense, especially in the near term. The ability to look at large scales of data, to understand the tradecraft that might go undetected by human analysts is rapidly increasing by some of the innovations. So I do believe that's our advantage today.
Mr. Carmichael, I have a minute left. Your testimony states that Mandiant, you helped identify solar winds and the Colonial Pipeline disruption in 2021. Would you say China's Volt Typhoon campaign is designed to make even these major hacks pale in comparison?
So far, we've only seen intrusion operations that were very hard to detect, that were orchestrated by Volt Typhoon, plus many other threat actors emanating from China. We don't yet know what they might do, but we could tell you the capability and the access that they have is very significant, and they could certainly do anything similar to what happened to Colonial Pipeline, or even much worse, with the access that we know that they have.
And how could we respond to a slew of disruptions to critical operators if all this is happening all at once, if they did something all at once?
It would be very difficult to respond to. There's a finite amount of security talent and investigators and incident responders that could help respond to security events. And so if there were a cascading set of security attacks against organizations, it would be incredibly difficult to respond to it.
All right, thank you, and I'll now yield.
Madam Chair, if you want to take another 5 minutes,
No, I'll wait.
Okay,
Yeah.
all right.
Okay, and I now yield to Mr. Connolly for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Evanina, you were ringing the alarm bell some time ago. You served in the Trump administration. What was your position?
Yeah, I started as the head of counterintelligence for the United States in 2014 under President Obama, and I stayed there until January 21.
Okay, and you, among other things, led efforts to protect security and integrity of the 2020 election from foreign threats. Is that correct?
That's correct, sir.
Last month, the New York Times published an article, China's advancing efforts to influence the U.S. election raise alarms, and it highlighted that during the 22 midterm elections, the cybersecurity firm Mandiant reported that an influence campaign linked to China tried to discourage Americans from voting while highlighting political polarization. The finding illustrates how China has been using Russia's disinformation to, quote, influence American politics with more of a willingness to target specific candidates and parties, including now President Biden. I ask that we insert this article into the record.
Without objection.
I thank the Chair. Mr. Evanina, during the Trump administration, is it true you were already ringing the alarm that both CCP and Russia were trying to influence that 2020 election?
Yes, sir.
And in August of that year, you issued an official press release warning, quote, we assess that Russia is using a range of measures to primarily denigrate former Vice President Biden and what it sees as an anti-Russian establishment. Your statement added, quote, for example, pro-Russian Ukrainian parliamentarian Andriy Derkash is spreading claims about corruption, including through publicizing leaked phone calls to undermine President Biden and his candidacy in the Democratic Party. I ask unanimous consent to insert that press release into the record.
Without objection.
Mr. Evanina, excuse me, is that the same Andriy Derkash who, according to reports, quote, gained access to Trump's inner circle through Rudy Giuliani, the president's personal lawyer?
Yes, sir.
Is that the gentleman in question?
Yes, sir.
And is he sitting with Rudy Giuliani?
Yes, sir.
Aha. In fact, just a month after you issued your statement, the Trump administration sanctioned him, to their credit, for being, quote, an active Russian agent for over a decade. Is that correct?
I believe that's correct.
Even though experts, including you and others, have repeatedly warned us about Russian efforts to smear Joe Biden with false information about corruption in Ukraine, and by the way, one of those informants who was the key witness of the oversight impeachment hearing is now in jail for lying to the FBI. Is that correct, Mr. Kelly? Are you familiar with that?
I don't have firsthand knowledge of that.
Well, do you have any thoughts, given your new role and your previous role, about the dangers that can ensue? Mr. Evanina warned us correctly about Russian disinformation inserting itself into our politics, and it sure did get into a very high level, both here in Congress and in targeting the President of the United States with absolutely false information. What could go wrong with that, Mr. Kelly? What should we worry about with that?
Malign foreign influence operations coming from Russia, China, or anywhere else is incredibly problematic, and in particular, in the context of elections. So I agree with that statement.
So in some cases, credulous people might take at face value information coming from social media bots, false sources who create false identities as Americans when they're in fact not. In fact, recently one of the big media companies just took down 5,000 accounts, I think I mentioned in my opening statement, all from China, pretending to be Americans. But the other is that political figures might use that information knowing or not knowing it's false for political gain, that could in fact be harmful to our system, especially given the fact it's based on false information and a foreign actor with an agenda. Would that be a fair statement, do you think?
Yes, that can absolutely happen.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. I would like to say for the record, most Republicans in Congress are actually banned from Russia. And when we're talking about false sources, false information, we could look no further in 2020 than mainstream media that covered up the laptop and the FBI and all those national security advisors that signed that letter. That was absolutely misinformation, disinformation, right before an election. So when we talk about foreign actors with an agenda, there are domestic actors with an agenda. So I would now like to recognize Mr. Moylan for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Mace and Ranking Member Connolly, for allowing me to wade into the hearing and speak on an issue that has plagued my district and the United States at large. The problem is clear. The People's Republic of China has unabashedly conducted cyber warfare against the United States for over a decade. The PRC uses proxy groups like Vote Typhoon to step attribution for these cyber attacks. As a veteran, I can personally say that divesting cyber attacks on the Office of Personal Management in 2015 was a cyber wake-up call. While many cyber attacks target our federal government, Chinese hackers' indifference towards targeting civilians is apparent. Chinese leadership, or their proxies, has continued to demonstrate a lack of concern toward attacking civilian infrastructures. Regardless of source, the blatant disregard, even to the extent of launching cyber attacks during an active Category 5 typhoon on Guam. Shutting down Guam's communications while extreme weather destroys billions of dollars worth of homes, businesses, and community facilities is simply inexcusable. So my question, Mr. Evelina, cyber represents a facet of Chinese gray zone warfare that the U.S. has struggled to contend with. Part of this problem stems from using cyber contractors to circumvent the Chinese Communist Party attributions for these attacks. With those companies in mind, could you recommend steps that the U.S. should take to properly distinguish who attacks us?
Congressman Moylan, thank you for the question, and thank you for your support and efforts in Guam and in the Pacific for us competing with our major adversary there. To answer your question, sir, I think first thing has to happen, we have to be more aggressive as a country, as an administration, working in partnership with Mandiant and others to attribute these criminal entities as what they are. They're proxies for a state-sponsored organization that we know as the Communist Party of China. China actors who are in the Ministry of State Security or the People's Liberation Army oftentimes work part-time jobs in these cyber organizations and do the bidding of the Communist Party of China, and oftentimes are utilized to do 0 days and other cyber activities to obfuscate attribution by the Communist Party of China. I think we have to get more aggressive as a country in attributing those entities as what they are, long arms of the Communist Party of China.
Thank you. Mr. Joyce, with the limited cyber personnel already, Guam cyber infrastructure suffers from deterioration and lack of funding, leaving civilian and military assets vulnerable to cyber attacks, while with Guam being one of the closest U.S. territories to China. What policy advice would you give the President, the Governor, or even myself to solve Guam's cyber insecurity?
Thank you, Congressman, for your question. I think the most important thing is we have to have the awareness and the priority on this crisis to give them the resources to get rid of old, outdated, and insecure hardware. A lot of the tactics used in the attacks are finding flaws that could have and should have been patched in old and obsolete equipment. So if you can get the budgets for the infrastructure so that they will have cyber-capable training, so that they will get rid of their old and antiquated technology, and that they have the resources to get the support of the private industry with the expertise, I think we can make a lot of headway on this problem.
Perfect. Final question. We've got about a minute for both of you, please. China's using the national cyber power to harass districts and state-level actors. Could the panel briefly explain the necessity of developing federal, state, or local cyber defense and responses?
Thank you, Congressman. I'll start. I think the state and local and tribal cyber capabilities are the weakest point for our nation. I think the Chinese Communist Party exploits that, especially at the county level. We see that throughout not only ransomware attacks, but also, as we'll start to see, in election infrastructure. It's the weakest level. And oftentimes, states throughout the United States don't have the money to invest and to replace the legacy hardware that Mr. Joyce talked about. I think that's going to be the first thing to do, is to pay for that legacy information to be utilities to be removed.
Mr. Joyce?
I think it's got to be a close collaboration between the private sector and the state, local, and tribal entities. They are often resource and expertise poor, right? Someone going to school with a cybersecurity degree, they're not excited to go into the local water utility and be their CISO. So we've got to then augment them with private industry and technology so that they can have top-notch security.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the panel. Thank you, Chairwoman Mace. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Moylan. And we're going to go for a few extra minutes until votes, which could be in a minute, could be in 10 minutes. So I would like to recognize myself for 5 minutes. I had a few extra follow-up questions I wanted to ask. Mr. Carmichael, rapid incident reporting by hack victims enables the identification of specific threats and limits the harm that they can inflict, but critical infrastructure operators vary widely in their knowledge of incident reporting protocols and in their compliance with them. So what can be done to improve incident reporting by non-federal entities?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question, Chairwoman. Incident reporting is a very difficult topic because there's a number of equities that need to be balanced. You can't disclose a security incident too early, especially if the threat actor still has access to the environment. It may do something more damaging, where they might escalate their attack, where they might steal more data. Obviously, you also don't want organizations to wait too long to disclose that there was a security event. And so there's definitely a very tough balance in terms of how long it actually should take for an organization to disclose. But at a minimum, we do want organizations to disclose so that the whole of community has the opportunity to learn from it.
Does the government provide clear guidance about these protocols?
There are a number of regulations and requirements for disclosure, so it is confusing to certain organizations to understand who do they need to report to, when do they need to report it, and they typically have to engage legal counsels to help understand the reporting complexities.
And if you're engaging legal counsel, it's probably pretty expensive for a business in some cases.
It certainly could be expensive, yes.
Do companies ever get punished? If they've been hacked by the government, do they get sued? Is there that kind of thing going on too when these things happen?
A lot of victims of cybercrime or cyber espionage feel like they are victimized multiple times. Mm-hmm. So they're first victimized by the threat actor, then they might be victimized by the media, by their customers, by their partners. And so, yes, it is certainly complicated, and they do feel like they're victimized often.
Is the government effectively sharing information it has about threat actors with the private sector?
There's a lot of information sharing that's occurring from a government perspective. Obviously, there could always be more information sharing, better information sharing, more timely sharing, but there is a lot of great things that are happening.
That's good to hear. And so talk to me, in your testimony earlier, you talked about legacy systems for a little bit. Talk to me about that and what dire straits we're in right now with regards to our vulnerabilities.
We very often find organizations that have antiquated technologies still deployed within their environments. Sometimes we see very old operating systems that are deployed that have not yet been retired but are still used for business-critical capabilities and functionality.
What's the oldest one you've heard of? What's been around the longest?
We still see Windows XP, which has been long end of life for quite some time.
How long?
I cannot remember how long it's been, but it's probably been more than a decade, if I'm not mistaken. That's in the IT environments. When you look at OT environments or operations.
Is that government specifically, or just, as you're saying, private industry?
Across the globe. When you look at the systems that are controlling safety at nuclear power plants or manufacturing facilities or pipelines, what we tend to find is that there's very old technology that exists out there that you can't actually apply software patches to. And so in the IT world, you expect that you would have to apply a critical security patch, in hours or days or maybe a month. In the operational technology world, sometimes the patch timing takes months, maybe a year, or maybe it never happens at all. And there's, generally speaking, there's other compensating controls that help mitigate the risk of a compromise of an OT environment. But essentially, if a threat actor could get into an operational technology environment, it could be a pretty bad day for that organization because there are generally very little controls in those OT environments with very old technology.
How do we incentivize technology updates, private and public sector?
I defer to my colleagues on this panel for,
Mr. Joyce and Mr. Evanina.
I think one of the things you have to do is you have to look at regulation, right? We would not have anti-lock brakes and seatbelts in our cars if it were just up to the industry. I am not a huge fan of regulation, but I'm increasingly convinced that the bare cyber minimums need to be regulated.
Mr. Evanina.
I would add on to that I think it's about leadership, and it starts with the government. I think if the government earmarked significant dollars, a moonshot, to update our own legacy systems, it would obviously prevent our adversaries from getting our government systems, and I think that would be a leading role to stimulate a private sector to do the same.
Yeah, we've had a lot of hearings up here, and the amount that is wasted, even in tech. I mean, we had a hearing last year, and DoD had wasted $300 million on a software program. I can only imagine what we could have done with $300 million in the cybersecurity space, either hiring workers or updating and upgrading software packages and technology to keep them safer. So I appreciate your time today, and thank you for being here. Do you want to be recognized for 5 minutes, Mr. Connolly?
Thank the chair. I want to go back to the danger of relying on Russian and China sources because they have an active agenda of insinuating. We've established one that you're familiar with, Mr. Evanina, and that was a key source for Rudy Giuliani and his false claims about corruption involving Ukraine, Burisma, and then Vice President Biden. And it's very dangerous to rely on sources like that. I want to point out 3 key sources for the impeachment inquiry on my other committee, the Oversight Committee, the full committee, and on the Weaponization Committee. 1, a man on the lam who's been charged by the United States government for being a Chinese spy outright. 2nd, a man who's in federal prison today for having been convicted of fraud. 3rd, a man named Alexei Smirnov, an FBI informant, in jail, charged by the FBI for lying to the FBI. He lied specifically about witnessing a cash bribe being given to President Biden, then Vice President, or out of office actually, and his son, Hunter. Neither was true. In fact, it's been established Mr. Smirnov didn't even meet anyone from Burisma until 2 or 3 years after the alleged exchange. And furthermore, Mr. Smirnov has admitted that his sources were Russian agents. Other than that, these are reliable witnesses upon which one of the most solemn constitutional duties that falls upon Congress has occurred, the impeachment of a president. We relied on Russian and Chinese agents. That's an established fact. Mr. Evanina, what are the risks when political leaders assert that claims of Russian or Chinese interference are just a hoax? Could something go wrong when we don't take it seriously?
Ranking Member Connolly, I think it's important to note that we should fully expect the Communist Party of China, Russia, Iran, and others to participate in the same type of disinformation, misinformation on the upcoming election. And I think we have to be postured to be able to identify that quickly and notify the American public as fast and as furious as we can, and then take action to notify individuals who are either part wittingly or unwittingly or being used by those nation states to promulgate their information. So I think that's really critical that we do that moving forward.
So I think, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I'm hearing you say, look, before we politically decide to dismiss something as an inconvenient fact, we need to have some skepticism about sourcing because of what Russia and China are doing.
Well, I think part of the playbook for Russia and China and others is to be able to sow doubt in all the reporting. And I think that's important. I think we should also take time to rely on the intelligence community, the law enforcement, the FBI, to be able to most effectively weed out some of this information, to be able to be in the best posture to provide that to decision makers.
And that's what you did during the Trump administration.
I think that's what the United States
Right.
government.
It's not a Democrat, or it shouldn't be a Democrat or Republican issue. Mr. Kelly, in your time in the FBI, does it echo what Mr. Evanina has cautioned us?
Yes, there was a.
I can't hear you.
Yes, in the last administration, the Justice Department actually came out with a policy on this topic, which I think was actually a very wise approach, which is to flag the source of information, and so to the extent that they have information that a malicious foreign actor has set up a false persona on social media, they can notify the social media platform so that they can take action under their terms of use. But to not get into the business of fact-checking, because that gets very, very tricky. So I think where the facts are that we have identifiable bad foreign actors that are doing things, that's an opportunity then to notify the affected people, to notify technology platforms, and then when it relates to specifically the functions of an election, misinformation around the polls have closed or the polls are open or the voting day moved or whatever else is happening, those are the kinds of things that public officials need to come out and absolutely correct the factual record on.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. And going back just to clarify with Alexei Smirnov, this committee was actually told by the FBI that we didn't know his name when we got the access to the FBI 1020 form, but the FBI told this oversight committee, quote, that the witness was trustworthy and credible, also repeated by Democrat colleagues here on the oversight committee, because that's what the FBI told us, and that witness actually was paid 6 figures by the FBI at over $500,000. So I don't know if the FBI just was incompetent in paying a witness that wasn't trustworthy and credible, or if they were lying to Congress in this committee when they said the witness was trustworthy and credible. And just a reminder, this hearing is about China, it's not about Russia, and we're talking about skepticism about sourcing. We should be very skeptical of mainstream media here today, who has fed the American people lies hook, line, and sinker. And in fact, the whole Russia hoax thing, Trump was not assisted by Russia. The Russia hoax was actually, Joe Biden getting paid off with his family members by Russian oligarchies and then lying about it. And we saw that in the testimony of Hunter Biden and his deposition. And we've seen these lies told over and over again by my colleagues across the aisle. Every time it's an accusation, it's really a projection. So with that, I will recognize Mr. Timmons for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Back to China. I'm going to talk about Huawei briefly, Mr. Evanita, Mr. Joyce. I'm going to ask you some questions at the end of it. So, China was using Huawei to give next-generation wireless technology to developing countries and to developed countries, many of which were our allies. And they were doing that at a rate that was beyond competitive. It was essentially subsidized. And the FBI was able to reach out to our allies and essentially say, hey, this is a really bad idea. They have a backdoor into security. Their servers aren't secure. You're essentially letting the Chinese have all your data. And so what happened? Well, all of our allies said they either took steps to ban Huawei or they changed their course and are now using more secure next-generation wireless technology. And that was done basically because the United States took a leadership role in informing our allies that China was not being a good actor, and it's caused Huawei to have to completely adjust their approach to the global economy. Is that fair, Mr. Joyce?
Absolutely.
Okay, so I think this is a great model. It's a great model of how we can address larger concerns. So obviously we're talking about cyber attacks, and there's no amount of money that the private or publicly held companies can spend to secure their networks from a government as big as China. There's just nothing they can do. It's not a question of if they're going to get a breach, it's a question of when. But what we can do is we can use the U.S. government and use our allies to create a consequence. So I don't see why the United States and like-minded countries will create a system through which the biggest issue is attribution in this proposal. If a company is breached and receives damages and it's from a nation state, I think that company should be able to go to the government and say, look, we do all of these things right to try to protect our data, but China came after us, we had a breach, it cost us this amount of money. Obviously there's going to be a civil suit, they're going to have to settle that civil suit with all of the individuals who had data breached. And so let's just say it's, I don't know, $100 million. So then the United States says, all right, attribution's good, China did this, the government did this, here's your $100 million, and then go and use trade tariffs to essentially make the United States whole. If we create a system like that, it can create a deterrent threat to nation states that are using cyber attacks as a tool. What do y'all think? Is that something that we should consider doing, Mr. Avenina?
Congressman Timmons, yes, but I will caution the subcommittee here that I think the back end of this is the concern I have. Looking at Huawei for 15 years, we were able to get the threat relayed to the Congress, who acted and had a rip and replace legislation. The problem we have is Huawei is a legitimate business entity that functions fairly well with an intelligence collection apparatus tied to it. If we rip it, we need to replace it with something different. And the trouble we've had, because we don't have the innovation and technology based in the United States to replace Huawei, we're still stuck with Huawei across our country in telecommunication systems. So to your point, I agree with, but we also have to have something to replace Huawei with when we rip it out.
Mr. Joyce, do you think that the international community could create this deterrent threat that would hold China accountable? Well, it's not just China. It's China, North Korea, Iran, Russia, anybody that is using cyber attacks as basically a state tool. Is that something that we could do?
I do, Congressman, believe we've got to use all the elements of our national power, right? Whether it is military, cyber, but increasingly commercial and tariff-related activities have proven pretty forceful, and we've seen the reactions to it. Unfortunately, a lot of these cyber criminals get to remain in places like North Korea, Russia, out of the reach of law enforcement cooperation. And so we've got to have other tools beyond law enforcement.
So I think that we can resolve that by saying that any individual that is attacking the United States, I mean, it's no different than the Taliban. I mean, we sent hundreds of thousands of U.S. soldiers and waged war for decades in Afghanistan because the Taliban allowed al-Qaeda to use it as a base of operations to attack the Twin Towers. So, I mean, there's no difference if al-Qaeda was using a computer in Afghanistan and using code to crash a energy grid in a hot area in the summer or a cold area in the winter. I mean, it could legitimately kill thousands and thousands of people if we are unable to provide heat in the Northeast during a winter storm. And it would be very easy to do that. And we would have to hold that individual accountable, but we'd have to hold the country that gave them safe harbor accountable. I mean, do we agree on this?
I completely agree, and I think your analogy is right with the terrorism, because if al-Qaeda had pre-deployed explosives or electromagnetic capability in New York City, is that different than Volt Typhoon and what they're doing here to potentially cause harm to our critical infrastructure? We have to look at that as a simple model.
And if there was a cyber attack on Goldman Sachs resulting in $500 million in damages, are we not going to then make them whole when they did nothing wrong versus if Hamas bombs their building? I mean, we're going to make them whole, so I don't think that we should view a terrorist cyber attack any differently than we would view a missile, because there's no difference effectively. Okay, I'm over time. Sorry. Thank you for your...
I agree. Cybersecurity is national security. Thank you, Mr. Timmons. In closing, I want to thank our panelists who are here this afternoon once again for your testimony today. With that and without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit materials and to submit additional written questions for the witnesses, which will then be forwarded to the witnesses for their response. So if there's no further business, without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned.